The steady beeping of medical monitors filled the quiet hospital room as he adjusted his position in the uncomfortable bed. It had been 3 days since his gallbladder surgery, and the recovery was going slower than he'd hoped. The white walls and antiseptic smell were starting to drive him crazy, but the doctors insisted he needed to stay for observation due to a minor complication. To pass the time, he found himself watching whatever came on the small TV mounted on the wall. The morning shows had bled into afternoon soap operas, and now the evening news was playing. He wasn't really paying attention until a familiar cruise ship logo caught his eye. It was the same luxury cruise line his parents had traveled on for their 40th anniversary. The news anchor's voice grew clearer as he turned up the volume. There had been some minor incident on board, nothing serious, just a temporary power outage that had caused some excitement among the passengers. The camera panned across the ship's deck, showing guests being interviewed about their experience. His hand froze on the remote control. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. There, standing against the backdrop of the sparkling ocean, was his wife. She was wearing a floral sundress he'd never seen before, her hair caught in the sea breeze. But that wasn't what made his heart feel like it was being squeezed in a vice. It was the fact that she was supposed to be at a business conference in Seattle. He blinked hard, wondering if the pain medication was making him see things. But when he opened his eyes, she was still there. The camera lingered on her for what felt like an eternity as she laughed about something the interviewer had said. She looked relaxed, happy, carefree, everything she hadn't been at home for the past few months. The conference materials she'd shown him flashed through his mind, the schedule of speakers, the hotel confirmation, even the email from her boss about the importance of this particular business trip. He'd helped her pack her formal suits and presentation materials. They'd talked about how much she was dreading the long sessions and networking events. With trembling fingers, he reached for his phone on the bedside table, nearly knocking over a half-empty cup of water. He opened their text conversation. Her last message had come just that morning. Another long day of presentations ahead. Miss you. She'd even sent a picture of what was supposedly the conference center's coffee shop. The news segment moved on to other stories, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he'd just seen. Had there been some last-minute change of plans she hadn't told him about? But no. The cruise ship was in the Caribbean, thousands of miles from Seattle. And that sundress, it was new, bought for a trip he knew nothing about. The pain in his abdomen from the surgery seemed distant now, replaced by a different kind of pain that radiated through his chest. He found himself hitting the call button for the nurse, not because of any medical emergency, but because he certainly couldn't bear to be alone with this discovery. When the kind-faced nurse arrived, he asked her if she could rewind the news broadcast. He needed to be sure, needed to know he wasn't imagining things. As they watched the segment again together, he saw the exact moment when the nurse realized why he'd called her. Her expression shifted from professional concern to genuine sympathy. "Sometimes the universe has strange ways of revealing the truth to us," she said softly, patting his hand. She didn't offer empty platitudes or advice, just quiet understanding. As she adjusted his pillows and checked his IV, she shared that she'd been through something similar years ago. It wasn't the same situation, but her words helped him feel less alone in that sterile hospital room. As night fell outside his window, he lay there watching the city lights flicker on, one by one. His wife's smiling face on that cruise ship kept playing in his mind like a movie on loop. The hospital room felt both too small and too big, too small to contain the weight of this revelation, too big to face alone. Tomorrow, he knew, he would have to start dealing with what he'd seen. But for now, he let himself feel everything, the shock, the hurt, the anger, and somewhere underneath it all, a strange sense of relief. At least now he knew why things had felt off for so long. The night nurse brought in his evening medication, and as he drifted off to sleep, he realized that while he'd come to the hospital to have something removed from his body, he'd end up leaving with something removed from his eyes instead, the veil of illusion that had covered his marriage for who knew how long. Morning came too quickly in the hospital room, bringing with it the harsh reality of what he'd discovered the night before. As he picked at his bland breakfast, his mind wandered back through the past few months, seeing everything in a new light. The memory of her planning this business trip was particularly painful now. He remembered sitting at their kitchen table 3 weeks ago, watching her create detailed spreadsheets of her supposed conference schedule. She'd even printed out fake agendas with the company logo, complete with speaker sessions and networking events. The level of planning made his stomach turn now. "You should see the schedule," she'd said, showing him the carefully crafted itinerary. Back-to-back meetings from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day. She'd sighed dramatically, playing the part of the overworked professional perfectly. "I'll barely have time to grab dinner before preparing for the next day's presentations." He reached for his phone, opening their shared calendar app. There it was, every day of the supposed conference mapped out in color-coded blocks. She'd even set up fake reminder notifications for different sessions. The attention to detail was almost impressive in a heartbreaking sort of way. His finger hovered over their text messages. Looking back, the signs had been there. The phone calls that always ended abruptly when he entered the room. The way she'd started taking her laptop to the garden to work on nice days, always positioned so he couldn't see the screen. Even her new password on her phone, something she'd claimed was required by her company's security policy. A young nurse came in to check his vitals, chatting cheerfully about the beautiful weather outside. He nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere, piecing together more clues. The late-night work calls that she took in the garage. The sudden interest in fitness that had her joining a new gym across town instead of the one near their house. The mysterious charges at department stores that she explained away as gifts for clients. After the nurse left, he pulled up their joint banking app. With trembling fingers, he started scrolling through recent transactions. Strange patterns emerged: restaurants he'd never heard of, boutique shops in parts of town she rarely visited, and oddly timed gas station charges that didn't match her usual commute. The hospital lunch tray arrived, but he barely noticed it. He was too busy examining their credit card statements from the past 6 months. Small inconsistencies jumped out at him now: extra coffee shops charges when she was supposedly in meetings, rideshare receipts at odd hours, sporadic charges at high-end stores that she never mentioned. His throat tightened as he discovered a pattern of Wednesday afternoon appointments at a salon across town, always during times she'd told him she had client meetings. He remembered how she'd started coming home on those days looking especially polished, claiming she just had a successful presentation or important meeting. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his hospital room as he continued his painful investigation. A notification popped up on his phone. A reminder for her conference dinner that evening. The irony made him laugh bitterly, drawing concerned looks from a passing orderly. He found himself opening their photos folder, scrolling through recent months. There were fewer pictures of them together, he realized. The ones she'd taken alone showed subtle changes: new jewelry he didn't recognize, different makeup styles, a gradual shift in her clothing choices. Everything pointed to a transformation he'd been too blind to notice. As evening approached, his dinner arrived along with more medication. The elderly volunteer who brought it noticed his distress and paused to chat. Without sharing details, he found himself talking about trust and betrayal in general terms. Her kind eyes and gentle wisdom provided unexpected comfort. "Sometimes people spend so much energy creating a perfect lie," she said while adjusting his water pitcher, "that they forget how easily truth finds its way into the light." Her words struck him deeply. How much effort had his wife put into maintaining this elaborate deception? Night fell again, bringing with it a strange mix of clarity and confusion. The physical pain from his surgery had begun to fade, but this new emotional wound felt raw and deep. He stared at the ceiling, remembering how she'd kissed him goodbye before leaving for her conference, promising to call every night. She'd even teared up a little, claiming she would miss him terribly. Tomorrow, she would supposedly be giving her big presentation to potential clients. Instead, she was somewhere in the Caribbean, living a completely different life. As he drifted off to sleep, he wondered which version of his wife was real: the dedicated professional he believed in, or the person who could orchestrate such an elaborate deception without missing a beat. The last thing he saw before sleep, claimed him, was the faint reflection of his wedding ring in the darkened window, catching the light from the hallway. It seemed to wink at him mockingly, like it knew secrets he was only beginning to uncover. The afternoon news played again, showing the same cruise ship footage. He hadn't changed the channel since yesterday, hoping to catch another glimpse to confirm what he'd seen wasn't just a pain medication-induced hallucination. The doctors had mentioned he could go home tomorrow, but right now, the sterile hospital room felt like a sanctuary from the reality he'd have to face. This time, he noticed details he'd missed in the initial shock. The way she leaned slightly toward the man standing beside her during the interview. How her hand rested casually on the stranger's arm while they laughed about the power outage. The matching designer sunglasses they both wore. His stomach churned, and for once it wasn't from the surgery. The man looked successful, expensive watch glinting in the Caribbean sun, tailored linen shirt, confident stance. He had the kind of polished appearance that spoke of boardrooms and business-class flights. Was this someone from her office? A client? Or a completely separate life he knew nothing about? His phone buzzed on the bedside table, another text from her. Just finished my presentation. It went really well. The message was followed by a photo of what was supposedly the conference room, clearly downloaded from the internet. He could see the stock photo watermark faintly visible in the corner. How had he missed these details before? The nurse came in to check his bandages, chatting about the cruise ship story still playing on TV. Looks like they're having better weather than we are, she said cheerfully. If only she knew. He managed a weak smile, not trusting himself to speak. The betrayal felt physical, like a second incision next to his surgical wound. His finger hovered over the call button on his phone. It would be evening on the cruise ship now. Would she answer? What would he say? The questions he wanted to ask stuck in his throat like unched tears. Having fun in the Caribbean? How's the weather in Seattle? Who's the man in the linen shirt? Instead, he found himself opening their wedding album on his tablet. 15 years of shared history stared back at him. The photos showed a younger version of them, full of hope and promises. He swiped through the images until he reached their first dance. Her white dress swirling, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. The memory felt like it belonged to someone else now. A text notification interrupted his thoughts, another message from her. Missing you lots. These conference dinners are so boring. He watched the typing indicator appear and disappear several times as she composed her next lie. Finally, wish you were here. The irony was almost too much to bear. The evening news repeated the cruise ship segment. This time, he forced himself to watch every detail. The reporter mentioned they were docked at a luxury resort for the next 3 days. He looked up the resort online. Honeymoon suites, couples spa packages, private beach dinners. His wife's conference was supposed to last exactly 3 more days. The night shift nurse brought his evening medication, noting his untouched dinner. You need to keep your strength up, she advised kindly. He nodded, but food was the last thing on his mind. The pills sat in their little paper cup, just like the bitter truth sat in his chest, waiting to be swallowed. Opening their shared photo cloud, he noticed she'd turned off her location sharing 3 months ago. The app was draining my battery, she'd claimed. He checked their mobile plan. International roaming hadn't been activated. She must have a second phone. The deceptions were stacking up like building blocks of a life he didn't recognize. As midnight approached, his phone lit up with another text. Heading to bed early. Big day tomorrow. He pictured her not in some Seattle hotel room, but on the cruise ship's deck, watching the stars with the man in the linen shirt. Was she using the same rehearsed smile she'd given him when saying goodbye at the airport? The hospital's night sounds filtered through his door, squeaking wheels, distant conversations, the soft shuffle of comfortable shoes on linoleum. Life going on as normal, while his world had tilted on its axis. He thought about all the moments leading up to this, the missed dinners, the distracted conversations, the growing distance he'd attributed to work stress. Tomorrow, he'd be discharged. Tomorrow, he'd have to decide what to do with this knowledge. But tonight, in this suspended reality of his hospital room, he let himself feel the full weight of what he'd lost. Not just his wife's faithfulness, but the certainty of his own judgment. The comfort of trust. The luxury of believing in simple truths. His wedding ring felt heavy on his finger as he finally drifted off to sleep. In his dreams, he confronted her on that cruise ship deck, speaking all the words he couldn't say in reality. But when he woke briefly at 3 a.m., he realized that sometimes the most powerful confrontations are the ones that happen in silence, in the space between what we know and what we say. The morning sun streamed through the hospital window as he sat propped up in bed, his tablet balanced carefully on the adjustable tray. The doctors had mentioned discharge tomorrow, but right now he had a different kind of investigation to conduct. With each tap and swipe, another piece of the puzzle fell into place, each revelation more painful than the last. The joint account login page stared back at him. It was an account they'd opened together years ago, but rarely used, or so he thought. As he scrolled through the transactions, a pattern emerged like a path through fog. Regular withdrawals at times that didn't match her work schedule. Charges at boutiques he'd never heard of, all clustered around Wednesday afternoons when she was supposedly in client meetings. A notification popped up on his tablet. A promotional email from the cruise line, ironically advertising the very same voyage his wife was on. With trembling fingers, he opened their shared email account, the one they used for household bills and travel bookings. The search term cruise revealed nothing. Of course, she would have used a different email address. The breakfast tray arrived, but he barely noticed the lukewarm coffee growing cold beside him. He was too absorbed in following the digital breadcrumbs. Credit card statements showed a story that had been hiding in plain sight: dinner reservations for two at upscale restaurants when she was supposedly working late, hotel charges in nearby cities during day trips to visit clients. His heart sank as he discovered a pattern of jewelry purchases, small items at first, then increasingly expensive pieces he'd never seen her wear. A receipt for a designer watch caught his eye, dated just 2 weeks before her business trip. The price made him wince, but it was the engraved message mentioned in the order details that truly hurt. "Time stands still when I'm with you." The physical therapist arrived for his morning walk through the hospital corridors. As they slowly made their way past other rooms, his mind was racing. Each step down the sterile hallway matched another step in his wife's carefully planned deception. The therapist noticed his distraction but kindly attributed it to post-surgery discomfort. Back in his room, he dove deeper into their financial records. A second credit card statement revealed spa treatments, couples massages, and romantic dinner cruises, all booked in pairs, all on days when she was supposedly buried in work. The cruise itself had been paid for months ago, broken into several smaller payments to avoid attention. His lunch sat untouched as he discovered a trail of rideshare receipts too, and from an address he didn't recognize. Google Maps showed it to be a luxury apartment complex across town. The timestamps matched perfectly with her evening client meetings that had become increasingly frequent over the past few months. A kind-faced volunteer brought him fresh water and paused to chat. He quickly switched his tablet screen to show the news, but not before noticing another charge that made his stomach clench: a reservation for a beachfront dinner at the cruise ship's most exclusive restaurant, scheduled for tonight. As afternoon faded into evening, he found himself looking at their photos from the past year with new eyes. Work events where she'd said phones weren't allowed, yet he found the same events posted on her company's social media, with no sign of her in any of the pictures. Weekend conferences that now showed up as hotel charges in entirely different cities than she'd claimed to be visiting. The night nurse came in with his evening medication, commenting on how intently he was studying his tablet. If only she knew he was watching his marriage unravel through a trail of digital receipts and carefully concealed transactions. Each new discovery felt like another stitch being removed from the fabric of their life together, except these weren't healing any wounds. He found himself looking at property rental websites, not even sure when he'd opened them. The thought of returning to their shared home, filled with memories and mementos of their 15 years together, suddenly felt impossible. Each room would be a reminder of a truth that had been hidden behind carefully constructed lies. As midnight approached, his tablet's battery warning flashed red, much like the warning signs he'd missed in his marriage. Before plugging it in, he opened their shared calendar one last time. There it was, the fake conference schedule, meticulously detailed, running parallel to the truth he'd discovered through bank statements and credit card bills. The night settled around him like a heavy blanket, but sleep remained elusive. The steady beeping of hospital monitors kept time with his thoughts as he stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring his discharge from the hospital, but today had brought a different kind of release: the truth, hidden in spreadsheets and bank statements, finally set free. His last conscious thought before drifting off was of the paper trail she'd left behind. How strange that in trying to hide her other life, she'd actually documented it more thoroughly than their real one. every receipt, every charge, every carefully concealed transaction. They all told a story she never meant for him to read, but one he now knew by heart. The discharge papers sat completed on his hospital bed as he took one final look around the room that had become both prison and sanctuary over the past week. His sister waited patiently in the hallway, unaware of how much had changed since she'd dropped him off for surgery 7 days ago. He hadn't told her yet, couldn't find the words to explain how his world had crumbled while watching the evening news. The nurses had noticed his shift in mood over the past few days, attributing it to post-surgery blues. If only they knew that his real recovery had nothing to do with the healing incision on his abdomen. The kind-faced volunteer who'd kept him company during late nights brought him a goodbye card signed by the staff. "Hope you feel better soon," it read. Some kinds of pain, he realized, didn't come with estimated recovery times. His phone buzzed with another message from his wife. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Last day of the conference today." He placed the phone face down without responding. The cruise ship would be returning to port tomorrow morning, the same time she was supposedly flying back from Seattle. He wondered which story she'd prepared to explain her tan. The wheelchair ride to his sister's car felt surreal. Hospital policy required it, though he could walk fine now. As they passed through the lobby, he caught a glimpse of the same TV that had shown him the truth about his marriage just days ago. It was playing a cooking show now, the host smiling brightly about family dinners and shared moments around the table. Instead of heading home, they drove to his sister's house in the quiet suburbs. He'd packed a bag before the surgery. Standard procedure for anyone living alone during recovery. The irony wasn't lost on him that this preparation for temporary solitude would now serve a different purpose. His sister chatted about work and her kids, filling the car with comfortable noise that required no response from him. At a red light, he pulled up the screenshot he'd taken of the news broadcast. His wife's smiling face on the cruise ship deck, the stranger's hand casually resting on her shoulder. It looked like a vacation photo from someone else's life. He printed a copy before leaving the hospital, planning to leave it on their bedroom dresser alongside his wedding ring. His sister's guest room was small but bright, overlooking a garden where her children's toys lay scattered in the afternoon sun. As she helped him settle in, making sure his post-surgery medications were arranged on the nightstand, he wondered how to tell her. How do you explain that while doctors were removing your gallbladder, fate was removing your illusions about your marriage? Evenings settled over the suburban street as he sat by the window, watching neighborhood kids play basketball in their driveways. Their shouts and laughter drifted up, a reminder of the normal life continuing outside his private earthquake. His phone kept lighting up with updates from his wife. Photos of empty conference rooms, complaints about boring speakers, messages about missing him. Each lie arrived with a cheerful ping, like Morse code tapping out the death of their marriage. He opened his laptop, the one task he'd been postponing all day looming before him. The email was surprisingly easy to write, each word falling into place like they'd been waiting to be typed. "I know about the cruise. Don't come home tomorrow. I won't be there." Short, simple, clear. His finger hovered over the send button for a long moment before pressing it. No dramatic accusations, no angry demands, just quiet acknowledgement of the truth they both now knew. The sound of his sister's family having dinner drifted up from downstairs. The normalcy of it, kitchen clatter, children's voices, the dog barking for scraps, made his own situation feel even more surreal. He should be home now, recovering in familiar surroundings, his wife fussing over his medication schedule. Instead, he was hiding in a guest room, waiting for her to discover that her carefully constructed lie had collapsed while she was sailing through the Caribbean. Night crept in, bringing with it the strange sounds of an unfamiliar house. His sister checked on him one last time, concern evident in her voice. "You seem different," she said softly. "Is everything okay besides the surgery?" He promised to tell her tomorrow, when the words might come easier. When his wife would have read the email, when it would all be real. In the darkness, he gazed at his wedding ring one last time before placing it in an envelope with the printed screenshot. Tomorrow, his sister would help him deliver it to the house, his final communication, more eloquent than any words he could write. The gold band caught the streetlight from outside, reminding him of how the sun had glinted off the cruise ship's rails in that fateful news broadcast. His last thought before sleep claimed him was of hospital rooms and healing. Some people came to hospitals to have things removed that were hurting them. He'd arrived to have his gallbladder taken out, but was leaving with something else excised as well, the tumor of deception that had been growing in his marriage, finally exposed and ready to be cut away. Her world began to unravel at exactly 6:47 a.m. when the cruise ship docked and her phone regained signal. The email waited like a digital hand grenade, its simple words destroying the elaborate fantasy she'd constructed. The carefully planned story about her conference experience died on her lips as she read those few devastating lines on her phone screen. The taxi ride from the port felt endless. Her hands shook as she tried calling him, once, twice, 15 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. Text messages disappeared into the digital void, unread and unanswered. The driver kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching her crumble in his backseat as reality crashed down around her. That house stood silent when she arrived, exactly as she'd left it a week ago, yet somehow completely different. The printed screenshot lay on their bedroom dresser, her smiling face captured from the news broadcast next to his wedding ring. The image seemed to mock her now, her carefree laugh, the sunshine, the perfect moment caught on camera that had destroyed everything. She sank onto their bed, still clutching her cruise ship tote bag, the price tags from her new vacation clothes now feeling like evidence of her crimes. The magnitude of what she'd lost hit her in waves. Each glance around their bedroom revealed another memory, another shared moment, another piece of their life together that she'd gambled away for. What? A fantasy? An escape? The first voicemail she left started with excuses, elaborate explanations about feeling lost and misunderstood. The second was angry. How dare he make such assumptions without letting her explain? By the fifth message, pride crumbled into desperate pleading. The 10th was nothing but tears. Each message disappeared into the same silence that filled their empty house. She found herself walking from room to room, touching familiar objects like a ghost haunting its own life. Their wedding photo on the mantel, the coffee mug he bought her last Christmas, the blanket they shared during movie nights. Each item held memories that now felt like accusations. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Opening her laptop, she began typing an email, trying to explain everything. Words poured out in a desperate flood about feeling stagnant in their marriage, about the thrill of something new, about how the cruise was supposed to be her goodbye to that temporary insanity. The email stretched longer and longer, full of justifications that sounded hollow even as she wrote them. She clicked send, knowing it wasn't enough. As evening approached, she drove to his sister's house, knowing he must be there. The lights were on, cars in the driveway, life continuing as normal behind those walls. She sat in her car across the street, watching shadows move behind curtained windows. Twice she reached for the door handle, twice she pulled back. What right did she have to disturb the peace he'd found? Back home, she tried a different approach. She created a shared document online, beginning to chronicle every moment of their 15 years together. Each anniversary, each small kindness, each inside joke and tender memory. She wrote about the real estate agent who'd shown them their house, about the time they got lost on their first vacation, about the night he'd held her through food poisoning without a single complaint. As if proving they had a history worth saving could somehow erase her betrayal. Her phone showed no signs of life except for work emails continuing to arrive, oblivious to her personal apocalypse. The irony of using work as her cover story now felt bitter, actual work messages flowing in while her marriage flatlined. She hadn't even called the office to explain her absence, letting the lie stretch in all directions until everything in her life felt false. Around midnight, she found herself in their home office, surrounded by papers and mementos. Tax returns filed jointly. Holiday cards signed with both their names. Insurance policies listing each other as beneficiaries. The paper trail of a shared life, as damning in its way as the credit card statements that had exposed her lies. Each document represented a promise she'd broken, a trust she'd betrayed. She tried one final voicemail near dawn, her voice raw from crying. No more excuses, no more explanations, just the truth, how the cruise that was meant to be her farewell to a mistake had become the revelation of it instead. How seeing herself on that news broadcast through his eyes had finally shown her the magnitude of what she'd done. How desperately she wished she could rewind time to before she'd ever considered leading a double life. Sleep eventually found her on their living room couch, still in her travel clothes, her phone clutched to her chest like a lifeline. The morning sun crept in, highlighting dust motes dancing in the air, tiny things made visible by light, just as her deception had been exposed by an accidental news broadcast. The house creaked and settled around her, adjusting to its new reality as a home divided by secrets finally brought to light. 6 months had passed since that fateful hospital stay, and now he found himself in a different kind of healing space. The therapy center's waiting room was warm and inviting, nothing like the sterile hospital environment where his life had changed forever. Soft music played in the background as he flipped through a magazine, not really reading it, just passing time before his weekly group session. Other people began filtering in, familiar faces now after months of shared stories and mutual support. There was the retired teacher whose husband of 30 years had led a double life, the young businessman whose fiancé had disappeared with their savings, the grandmother who discovered her spouse's secret family. Different stories, same pain, shared healing. Today was his turn to share updates with the group. As he settled into the comfortable circle of chairs, he touched the empty spot on his finger where his wedding ring used to be. The indentation was finally fading, just like the sharp edges of his pain had slowly begun to smooth over. Not gone, but different, more like a scar than an open wound. The group therapist, a gentle-voiced woman with kind eyes, nodded encouragingly as he began to speak. He told them about finally sorting through the last box of photos from their shared life, about finding the strength to delete their wedding video from his cloud storage, about running into his former wife's best friend at the grocery store and feeling only a dull ache instead of crushing pain. The strangest part, he found himself saying, is how that hospital stay changed everything. I went in to have something removed that was making me sick, but I ended up having my blindness removed too. It hurt more than the surgery, but it was just as necessary. The others nodded in understanding. They'd all had their moments of revelation, different circumstances but the same sudden clarity that changes everything. One member mentioned how she discovered her partner's deception through a mistakenly shared Netflix account, another through a forgotten receipt in a coat pocket. His had come through a news broadcast in a hospital room. During the break, he stepped outside into the center's small garden. Spring was arriving, tiny buds pushing through the soil, reaching for sunlight. 6 months ago, he couldn't have imagined feeling this steady, this okay with being alone. His sister had been right when she said healing wasn't linear. Some days felt like progress, others like sliding backward, but overall, he was moving forward. Back in the session, they discussed triggers and coping mechanisms. He shared how he'd finally canceled their joint credit cards, closed their shared email account, removed himself from their mobile family plan. Each small act of separation had felt like setting down another stone he'd been carrying. The weight hadn't disappeared, but it was becoming manageable. Someone asked about forgiveness, that complex topic that always stirred deep emotions in the group. He thought about the last email he'd received from his wife 3 months ago, her words full of remorse and explanations. He hadn't responded, but he had read it without feeling the need to throw his phone across the room, progress of a sort. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened, he found himself saying. It's about freeing yourself from carrying it. The therapist smiled, noting how different this was from his first session, when he could barely speak about his experience without shaking. After the session, he walked through the park instead of heading straight home. The same park where he'd spent countless hours in those first raw weeks after leaving the hospital, trying to make sense of how life could change so completely while watching an evening news report. Now he could appreciate the spring weather, notice children playing, feel the sun on his face without everything being overshadowed by betrayal. His phone buzzed, a message from someone he'd met at a photography class he'd started taking. Nothing romantic, just friendly conversation about camera settings and lighting techniques. 6 months ago, the idea of connecting with anyone new had seemed impossible. Now it felt like part of his healing, learning to trust again, one small interaction at a time. At home, he watered the plants on his apartment balcony, new plants, in new pots, in a new space that had never known his old life. The therapy homework for the week was to write a letter to his past self, the one lying in that hospital bed, watching the cruise ship news report. What would he tell that version of himself? As evening settled around him, he opened his laptop and began to type. Dear past me, I know right now you feel like your world is ending. In a way it is, but what you don't know yet is that endings make space for beginnings. That hospital room feels like a prison, but it's actually the doorway to your freedom. The truth you discovered there hurts more than any surgery, but it's the kind of pain that leads to healing. The words flowed easily now, unlike the stilted journal entries he forced himself to write in those early days. He ended the letter with the truth he'd finally come to accept. Sometimes the greatest act of love you can show yourself is being willing to see the truth, even when it comes in the most unexpected ways, like a random news broadcast in a hospital room showing you exactly what you needed to see.